Welcome to LinkedIn Live. This is my first time back since November, I think, and I am lucky enough to have corralled and brought in, maybe dragged in by force, Daniel Wood and Josephine Wolf, two of the authors that I love in the cyber insurance space. And I would say, maybe biased, probably the most well-known in our cyber insurance space, because this is such a niche area, and the amount of scholars that have actually printed stuff. I mean, we all wish there was even more. That's why we're begging you to write more, Josephine and Daniel. But I'd love to quickly introduce yourself to everyone, and also remind everyone that even though we're only going 30 minutes, the chat function in LinkedIn, and you can comment and we can see it. So Daniel, what's your background in one sentence?
Oh, one sentence. I started my PhD on cyber insurance back in 2015. I have two hats. One, a lecturer at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. The sun is shining for once. And the other is at Coalition as a security researcher.
And Josephine?
I'm a professor at Tufts University where I work on cybersecurity policy, and I came to insurance kind of in a roundabout way because I was interested in liability for cybersecurity.
Through this book?
Exactly.
You mean
and
this one led to this one?
Exactly. Everybody kept saying insurance is going to solve this problem. You really need to learn about it. And that was how I got sort of sucked into this world, and very happily so.
Well, awesome. Thank you so much for spending 30 minutes. Josephine has joined me before on a different book club, so she knows that I love to get into the actual meat. And no one really loves sitting in for an entire hour webinar. So we're going to jump into some of the questions about how academics navigate this area of neutrality when it's a business based on relationships. A couple ground rules first. One, nobody's needs to talk about the war exclusion. Don't ask about the war exclusion. It's covered. We talk about it enough. I really want to get kind of deep into the reports and the writings. There's already someone commenting on here. The question I have for you first is, you get asked a lot about your writings. People recognize your name. What is the question or takeaway that the audience comes to you with the most? What's the most powerful? Maybe not your favorite, but what's the thing that you get asked about the most?
So for me, the thing that had the most kind of broad appeal was way back in 2021, I looked across about 25 different insurers panels and just did a very simple bar chart, which providers appeared most frequently. I shared it as kind of like an innocent little lamb academic, and it went viral in the community. Like, people were sharing it, chatting about it. And so for me, that was the one that was most surprising.
Have you been told why, like the predictions, why it went viral?
I think it confirmed intuitions people had, and this sense of how fair it is, how insurers send work to different providers.
I think what came to my mind, because I've been on the incident response technical side, you can't find these panels out. There's only a couple that have it in a public way. So when I stumbled upon your report, I was like, oh, thank God there's someone that looks at all of these, because it felt like this closed door as far as panels go, right? You didn't really know if you were on the panel. Sometimes you don't even know if you're what the insured sees, right? Like, you're told you're on a panel, you might not be actually on the panel. We don't have to get into all that. But Josephine, what about you?
So I think the thing I hear most often, not from insurers, but from policymakers or cybersecurity people interested in this space, is really some variation on, is cyber risk insurable? Is this, is this industry going to work? Things like that. And I actually think it's a little bit of a funny question, is cyber risk insurable? Because we do insure lots of cyber risk, but it does not, in my experience, stop people from kind of returning to that and asking that with some regularity.
Well, I'm sure they quote back at you the whole cyber is uninsurable quote that was kind of ripple effect a year ago or a year and a half ago, from one of the leaders of insurance. And there's always LinkedIn people too that like to throw out that controversial view. What about now? So now I want to get into the neutrality piece. I think what's very unique about your position in your writing, and your studies, because a lot of what you do, Daniel, is actual empirical evidence and data and comparison of data. It's hard data in a industry based on trust, and financial backing and relationships and friendships. And this is how we do things, thinking about Lloyd's and thinking about how we have seen insurance evolve over the last 400 years. Um, but how do you navigate this neutrality without making enemies and pointing out all the flaws?
Yeah, so I think it's tricky. I would say there's kind of two different kinds of research questions, and one is much more contentious than the other. So if you think about the figure I described, it's just a descriptive figure about which IR providers are on which panel. I think people are generally quite positive about that kind of result. It's good to collect data, it's good to show it, good to share it. I think where things get really contentious is questions like, is the fact that, a couple of IR firms or law firms are on 80, 90% of insurers' panels, is that a good thing? That is where things get very contentious. And I actually think as academics, we don't have a good answer to that question. And all we can really do is present different perspectives, different, potential explanations.
I would say I think the study where I made the most enemies, I don't know if Daniel would agree, is actually the one we did together, which was an interview study of a lot of breach coaches and other people associated with the industry about some of the challenges in trying to collect and share data about incidents. And what was interesting about it to me was the interviews themselves were not contentious, right? We were sort of asking people, how do you approach this process? What are the things that you do to protect your clients and their information? And then when we wrote it up, I think some of it was perhaps that the initial title was something like "How Lawyers Undermine Cybersecurity," and maybe that was a mistake on our part. But that was sort of the first time I kind of had this feeling of like, oh, we've really upset some people who are involved in this industry and feel that we have not done them justice.
Sorry, I was too busy looking at the questions. That's why I have to turn the comments off sometimes, because all the people that are commenting I love, like David Finns, Maverick. Okay, so now we're going to get to so we go back to the relationships and how this is built. What have you seen? I mean, you clearly in your book commented you found interesting people in your book, Josephine, and Daniel. You quote people and players that we know and love in our group, but what have you seen that's really good about the relationship aspect of insurance, the trust that's been built and the way that things are done?
That's an interesting question. I think one thing that I think is really positive is that there is a lot of sort of very frank discussion within this community, I feel, about some of the uncertainties, some of the, we don't have as much data as we'd like. We're not coming in kind of with the sort of, we know everything, we can predict all of the risk perfectly. And I think that actually really surprised me when I started working with this community, that sense that, people were just very honest about, look, I wish I were doing this or I were able to do this in a more kind of rigorous way, but we're working within these constraints. And I do think that sort of the relationships between people across insurance have made it possible for them to talk to each other and to talk to researchers pretty frankly about that.
And the answer where I go with this is, I actually think it's surprising how little cyber insurance coverage litigation there's been, because it's a completely new area of law. There's not much precedent. And my opinion is that results from essentially relationships. Carriers don't want to, be in a contentious case where they exclude a claim when they know that broker in the future will decide whether they get business or not. And that's where I think actually the relationship aspect means the product can exist and build a reputation.
Yeah, there was something I read, an article yesterday, something about certain claims teams were more known to say, well, if it's gray, we'll pay. And I've never heard that, but I love the idea that, like, I mean, I'm not speaking for anything related to insurance here. I just see that quote and realized in that quote, it kind of assumes that relationship piece. And I guess I want to turn it around and say, then why in a cybersecurity community, do we always get the question about not covering claims? Because I feel like there's so much that insurance does according to its purpose, right? And the claims process works in, so many out of the thousands and thousands of claims that they deal with. Why does the cybersecurity community have that instinct that but you're not going to cover it? You're not going to cover it if I mess up. You're not going to cover this if I say the wrong thing. I feel like they're a little bit trepidatious in approaching insurance and even letting insurance inside inside and under the hood of the car.
Well, I think one part of the answer, and I'm as guilty of this as anybody, is we have a lot more information about the claims that don't get paid and that get contested, right? So when I sit down to write a book about cyber insurance, I don't have detailed information about all of the claims that get paid, but I can go hunt down the lawsuits and sort of find out a lot more about what doesn't. And so that becomes just much more highlighted, not just by me, but by everybody who wants to write about this space. Those are sort of the stories that are out there in a perhaps more kind of prominent way. And I think the other piece of this kind of comes from that fear of, is this a sort of stable industry? Is this something where I should be worried about kind of growing cyber threats or nation state attackers or things like that? And the sense of uncertainty about what the future of it's going to look like.
And that's where I don't know what the solution would look like. It would be really cool to have public and kind of the shade of gray across different carriers and be able to actually say, this carrier pays whatever percentage of claims, but we just don't have that, and we rely on reputation systems. And as an academic, it would be great if we could solve that, but of course it's difficult.
Well, I mean, I think that is a good point. There's no way they're letting you have that data on that end. But it would be very interesting, hard facts to go through. So now we're going to get to more of the arbitrary question that I have is what is your favorite part of the cyber insurance food chain? So we got brokers, carriers, breach counsel, incident response, technical firms. What's your favorite part? And then I have another arbitrary question after that.
Since we're on your LinkedIn Live, I will say breach attorneys, and this comes from our interview study. Exactly. We spoke to breach attorneys, digital forensics people, insurance people, and the lawyers we would come away afterwards and we were like, they are just really impressive people. They have very clear thoughts, the way they speak. Just purely in terms of doing interviews, I enjoyed it most with the breach attorneys. A lot of people are going to kill me for that.
No, I love hearing that though, because I have a different perspective. I really like brokers because of the creativity. Like I feel like half the stickers that I've created or sayings jokes that I've formulated are bantering with brokers. And I feel like they're a really creative group of our area. What about you, Josephine?
So I was also going to say brokers, and I think what's interesting to me about brokers is, to my mind, and you would probably know better than I, they do so much of the kind of conflict resolution work around sort of smallish disputes, not escalating into bigger ones in cyber insurance claims. And I've always been very interested in that process, partly because it's a very hard one to study, where you don't have, necessarily denied claim, but you have a little bit of tension around like, are we really going to pay this? Is there some way to wriggle out of it? And I see the brokers as being very pivotal to the process of sort of how do you resolve that smoothly, kind of coming back to what Daniel was talking about in the relationships in this space, trying to kind of keep that on a more level setting and not letting things escalate.
I love knowing that you saw that, because we see it on the internal side, but it's also this balance between setting expectations, because they're with the client long term. And then also sometimes the client forgets who's the broker and who's the carrier. They all sound like insurance names. Sometimes they sound like law firm names. And they get mixed up because they they only want to use this in case of emergency. Now the tide's kind of turning more on the services side, which is why I have a role, is how to prevent things, how to work on the front end, to think about how we're going to approach crisis situations. Another arbitrary question to follow up is, who's your favorite insurance person?
I don't know, Violet. It's got to be you, or maybe
Oh,
Monique
no, we can't
Ferraro.
do that. You got to throw out a real answer. Someone you interviewed, someone you engaged with, someone that lights up your day when this is a shout out part. I like to just highlight people.
Yeah, I will go for way back in 2021. I was trying to recruit people for interviews, and a lot of people said no, but there were a few who said yes. So people like Anthony Hess, Cameron Carr, Luke Johnson, Jason Rebholz. I know they're quite active on LinkedIn, so people might know the names. But they helped a young researcher who had no reputation. I was at a random university in Austria, and I will always appreciate that.
That's amazing. I think a lot of cyber people have those people in their mind too. We all have the people that gave us the time. And I've even heard it from people that have been in it longer. I've been in cyber for 10 years. There's people, that have been in it for 20, like Josephine, like your chapter called Breach on the Beach. It kind of describes that building of insurance from the first product, 1998, and kind of the adoption and changes throughout. Even those attorneys will talk about the people that gave them time and energy, not just attorneys, sorry, even those players will talk about those people. And so I agree with you. There's the people that make room for academic questions. And I think what's beautiful about cyber insurance, just going to gush here, is that we're all in this really kind of, besides competitive, pricing and all that stuff, we're very much learning this as we go, because this is new, because there's not a government policy around it, because we're trying to figure out what controls match. We're all kind of sharing information and help to each other, especially when it comes to learning. I think that's a very much a theme in our world of cyber insurance. I don't know how the other insurance lines progress and debate and talk, but cyber insurance is pretty open. What about you, Josephine?
I think Monique has been a shining light in so many ways. I also think, coming back to sort of the interviews we did with attorneys, one thing that is really sort of humbling about interviewing breach attorneys is, one thing we asked them is sort of, about these panels and why they were or weren't on panels. And a lot of them said something to us, like, well, I bill $1,400 an hour, so I can't be on a panel. And there's something about somebody who bills $1,400 an hour giving you an hour of their time to interview them, which really makes you feel like this was incredibly generous. So I'm not going to call them out by name, because I think, given the results of that survey, most of them would not want to be associated with it anymore. But I will say I've been very sort of grateful to how many of them have been willing to give time to that project.
Well, I mean, I think what you also touch on is there's attorneys that, don't play on the insurance panels because of the rates too high, but there's a very different opinion, because there's certain people on the insurance side, breach counsel, that say, well, we deal with consistent cyber incidents, and we are familiar with the players, we're familiar with the threat actors, we know more on experience. And then on the other side, they'll say, both sides of the coin will say, we're better than you, basically, or there's some advantage on both sides, right? Or we're cleaning up after the other side. And I always thought that was so interesting, because I've never actually seen the data to support whether the $1,400 an hour are any better compared to the experience of the lower. And when you, like you said, Daniel, impressive, they impress me the same. They both sides, if you are a true cyber attorney and it's all you do, cyber and privacy, they all have a very core knowledge of understanding privacy, data, understanding regulations, compliance rules, and understanding how to be a therapist as you're working through a devastated client, holding hands and establishing privilege along the way. So I don't know, Daniel, have you ever seen any data on comparing the different types of breach counsel?
No, so never seen the data. The way we tried to get around that methodologically was to essentially ask other people in the ecosystem about the party you're interested in. And you're right, people have different views. Some people say that, as you say, you build up a relationship and it's super efficient. And then other people say, oh, they send, junior attorneys and they maybe don't have enough experience. And I actually thought we just couldn't come down on either side. I think it's a big unknown.
Yeah, I like the unknowns because then it keeps it spicy and we keep learning, right? I have a very so I went on a Daniel Wood rabbit trail at like 6 a.m. this morning. Josephine, you already know that I'm, read your book to tatters. But I wanted to ask Daniel, one of your titles and studies was very, to me, interesting that people don't address. And I guess 8 or 9 years ago, I got this question first from brokers saying, is there any kind of warranty when I was on the technical side? Is there any kind of warranty that you can offer that your product, if your product results, the function of your product results in a breach or cyber incident, then you will warranty your product? And I'd be like, that doesn't exist. That was my answer. That there's no way that exists. There's no way there's a warranty from a product perspective. Well, guess what? Someone figured it out and was smart enough to make it exist. And now we're seeing, and 1 million seems to be the number on certain EDR platforms, MDR, certain levels of product now come with a cyber warranty. What I love about your article is it said cyber warranties, market fix or marketing trick. I'll just say your awareness of it possibly being smoke and mirrors was just fantastic, because that's one of the reasons I said it doesn't exist. Because I was like, well, what's the use? Playing it to the conclusion, how are we going to go and collect it and where is it going to come in was my thought initially. But tell me about that study. Was that a dramatic study that people picked up on, or can we make it viral right now?
Yeah, I mean, it would be great. I think the main finding from that study is, theoretically, it makes great sense. You can trust the vendor more if they provide a bigger warranty, because they would ultimately pay the consequences. I think in practice, what we found is the way they're written, there's so many exclusions, small print. So for instance, the $1 million warranties are actually $1,000 per machine. So if you're just a small company with, only so many machines, you don't get the full limit. So I think, this is, again, going back to the broker piece. There's not a broker for warranties. So it's difficult to have someone to talk you through the terms and actually understand.
So when you were doing that study, I had a great question prepared just then. I'm trying to figure out whether or not, when it comes up, was it mostly handled outside of a claims process on the back end, or did it factor into some kind of, they covered this, so claims doesn't have to cover that 1 million or that 1,000 per machine? So how did you see it actually work with insurance, the warranty versus the insurance claim?
Yeah, so I think we just need better data. I think, I don't really have a good answer. Don't have a good answer.
We don't really know, because I haven't figured it out either. Okay.
I mean,
that's another good. We're gonna have these takeaways, and then we're gonna see how can we solve them in the next 10 years. Figure out the data. What about Josephine? I will tell you, I send this book. There's probably people on here right now listening to us that have received a random Amazon package with this in the mail. One of the most impressive chapters to me was that I never quite understood the escalation of silent cyber from a CGL policy. You mastered it in one chapter, and I tell people that even attorneys usually can't explain it as well as this one chapter does. You explain cyber coverage. How did you become an attorney overnight?
Well, it certainly wasn't overnight. I spent years and years trying to learn insurance. And I think one of the things that's very humbling about wandering into a field that's really not your own, because my background is in cybersecurity, is people years in would tell me things that I was so embarrassed by. So Daniel and I worked with another amazing professor, Daniel Schwartz, at the University of Minnesota. And at one point I sent him that book manuscript, and he wrote back to me, he had some amazing comments. He said, and by the way, policyholder is one word. in insurance, right? I sort of had this feeling of like I've been writing about insurance for, 18 months, and I had somehow totally missed that. So I will say, a lot of it is sort of being patient with yourself and accepting that there are so many people who know this world so well, and you're going to have to sort of go in as a beginner. And there are still things, right? Daniel and I did some work on insurance linked securities for a recent paper, which were again something where I felt like I barely understood what it was that we were talking about, and I had to again kind of go in with that humility to learn something that other people knew much better. But I will say, I mean, it's been an incredibly welcoming community, an incredibly patient community with me. I feel like I have done so many interviews where people are explaining to me things that are so obvious, not just to them, but to everybody they work with, to everybody who's in their roles. And I've been very grateful for that and sort of the willingness to teach that so many people in this industry have had.
So who are the best explainers then? Who were we said, who were the people that you were impressed by, right? But was it different from the people that could translate it the best to you? And I'll give the example. When I was really trying to understand tech 8, 9, 10 years ago, I literally had one of my mentors say, networking it's one box, it's connected to another box, right? Like you very much had to simplify it for me to learn, understand networking and start getting into how technology was connected. I'm just curious, and how did, who translated for you?
Gosh, a lot of people. I will say, I'm always a little nervous about calling out the people I've interviewed because I worry a little that many of them I don't always quote by name, or I don't know if they want to be closely associated with the things I've said about those cases. But since we have him on the call, I do want to mention Daniel, who also read that book manuscript and also sort of understood this space in a much more kind of profound way than I did, and probably still than I do, and helped me think in really nuanced ways about this intersection of cybersecurity and insurance. And Dan Schwartz, who's an insurance lawyer, who was also, incredibly patient with me, to say nothing of all of the lawyers who were sort of working on these lawsuits and explaining to me, I think, things that were not always true, right? So like I talked to some people about the NotPetya lawsuits when they were just beginning, and I had lawyers saying to me, like, this is it, this is the final nail in the coffin, we're gonna stop people from filing these kinds of claims. And I think there was just a real openness that one does not always get when you're looking at lawsuits, when you're looking at policy disputes like this. Similarly, the policymakers, right? Tom Finan spent a lot of time talking to me about sort of some of the Department of Homeland Security efforts around this. People like that were incredibly generous.
So I know we only have 2 minutes left, and I always like to end right on time so we can get on with our day. But thinking about final parting words of wisdom, a sentence, some kind of thing to end with. One of the questions that I have, though, is, Daniel, you had some person that was working with you on a study that won a scholarship for one of the cyber conferences, and we got to welcome her in. My question is, how many other, proteges or Daniel and Josephine Wolfs are there out there that are interested in the subject? Do you see this academic field growing? Because Josephine, you just mentioned learning from Daniel. Who's learning from you in the academic side?
So to give it like a short plug, I would just say people who've researched cyber insurance could be potential, hires. So Rechta Jain, who worked on a project on personal cyber insurance, got hired by Allianz. She just spent a year as a researcher reading different personal cyber insurance policies. And I think they appreciated that she did it in a rigorous, structured way and could then apply that in her new role. And yeah, she got the scholarship to go to she got the scholarship to go to Zywave, and yeah.
I love that plug, though, because I didn't know we were going to end with career advice, but I do think that there's some edge that you have now with the neutrality that you can balance both, right? You can learn the relationship side, but bringing in and being able to interpret data makes your field so valuable in our little insurance bubble. So parting words, anything final to say, Josephine and Daniel? Josephine?
I want to say thank you to sort of everybody on the call, and more broadly everybody who's given their time to this research. I think you can't imagine how much of the stuff that is sort of common sense and common knowledge to you is new and interesting and not well understood in the research community, and how grateful we are when you let us sort of pick your brain.
Yeah, and I would kind of go along the same lines. There are ways to get in touch with researchers and help shape the research, and that is how it becomes more accurate and more useful for the community.
Well, thank you so much for your time, both of you. It was so fun to get to pick your brain, and I'm sure everyone wishes they could ask questions too, but maybe there's a next time. Thank you for coming, and have a great day.